Hey everybody, it's Roger. I'm back, and we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video. I'm the creator of the Azure Sandbox, and in our last video, we successfully cloned the GitHub repo for the Sandbox down to our WSL environment, and we were able to view it in VS Code, and we were going to pick up with actually deploying our first configuration that's part of the sandbox, which the shorthand for is VNet shared. So let's go ahead and navigate up to our vanity URL, aka.ms/Azure Sandbox. So I'll pull that up. And that takes us to the Azure Sandbox guide up in the Azure Architecture Center. And you can link directly from here to the GitHub repo for the Azure Sandbox. So that happens here in this Deploy the Sandbox section. So the last reference to the GitHub repo is this configure client environment, which we've done. And we've done this part here. We've cloned the GitHub repo down to our Windows subsystem for Linux environment. We've gone over all the networking, the default networking for the sandbox. And we're going to pick up here, which is applying sandbox configurations. So the first one that we want to deploy is this VNet shared. So let's click on the link and navigate there. Now, VNet shared is just a folder beneath the Azure Sandbox repo. And the way I've organized this is each configuration is in a separate folder. And VNet shared is a required configuration for all of the other configurations. So if you want to do anything with the sandbox, you have to deploy this one first. So just kind of a quick overview of what's in VNet shared. So when we finish deploying VNet shared, you're going to have all of these things deployed on a single Azure subscription, which you've set up previously in your prereqs. And then you're going to have a resource group, the default name for which is rg-sandbox-01. If there are multiple people deploying sandboxes on the same subscription, you could just change that to 01, 02, or whatever you want, just to help you tell them apart. So within that resource group, that's a collection of different Azure resources. There's a variety of things that get deployed. There is a virtual network called VNet Shared -01 with the CIDR range that you see here, 10.1.0.0/16, and that's the default IP address range for that VNet. And as we spoke previously, you can go with non-defaults to crush them down to make them smaller. A /16 is pretty big, and your networking people, their eyes are going to get wide when they see that. Just assure them that you're okay. This is an island environment, has no connectivity whatsoever to your private network, and that's what sandboxes are, okay? Completely separate. So within VNet shared, this little symbol here in the architecture diagrams indicates a virtual network. I've carved out two subnets. One is for Azure Bastion, which is 10.1.0.0/27. Azure Bastion requires a subnet called Azure Bastion subnet with that size, the /27. And within that, we will deploy the Azure Bastion service, which has backing compute nodes, as well as a public IP address. So this service, this Azure Bastion service, is what you're going to use to get secure RDP and SSH access to your virtual machines in the sandbox. You're going to log on to this Bastion host using your Azure Active Directory credentials that you've been set up for in your subscription. And in using the Bastion, we can come through that secure Bastion host using, authenticated Azure Active Directory credentials instead of hanging public IPs off your VMs and RDPing directly into those. All the VMs in the sandbox use private IPs, and that's really important best practice from a security perspective. So this little symbol down in the bottom right here means that this subnet, Azure Bastion subnet, has a network security group associated with it. And that network security group helps control what traffic is allowed in and out of that subnet. And we'll explore that in more detail later. The second subnet that we've defined is called SNET ADDS-01, and that stands for Subnet Active Directory Domain Services -01. Why the -01? It's the first subnet that I'm using for Active Directory domain services, and so I just named it 01. If you have other ones in other regions, you could name it 02, 03, whatever. It's just a naming convention that I chose. And that subnet is 10.1.1.0/24. So you can see with the IP addressing scheme, if it's 10.1.0, you know that's the Bastion host. If it's 10.1.1, you know it's something inside this Active Directory Domain Services subnet. So it just helps to eyeball the IP address range and be able to make that correlation. Some other services. Let's talk a little bit about here. This VNet, this overall VNet shared -01, has some configurations set on it that are important to understand. The first is that we automatically configure the DNS server to 10.1.1.4 by default. And what that is that's the private IP address for the NIC on this virtual machine here called ADDS1, which we'll talk about in a second. So any DNS queries that happen in this virtual network, in this VNet shared 01, will first go to this IP address to get resolved. And then second, if it doesn't get resolved there, it'll get forwarded off to Azure DNS to see if it can get resolved there. And that's basically everything else. Okay. So within this subnet, we're going to deploy a single virtual machine called ADDS1, and we're basically going to use this as a domain controller for a dedicated Active Directory domain services domain for our sandbox. And we can use that domain controller to domain join VMs, to do LDAP queries, to set up Kerberos authentication to Azure files, all kinds of stuff. And that's one of those tricky pieces of infrastructure that you need to have in place in order to do any development in Azure. So being able to have one automatically configured for you to use as part of the sandbox environment gets you out of having to try to get your IT staff to let you into their private Active Directory domain services infrastructure, which they're not going to want to do. Your security people won't want that either because that's the keys to the kingdom. So you need your own domain controller. You need your own domain in your sandbox completely separate from your private network. And this is a single domain controller that we're using here. We're doing that for cost, by the way. Normally you would have a pair of them deployed in a high availability configuration. But since this is a sandbox, it's okay if, that machine goes down for a little bit. We can wait for it to come back up because this is not a production environment. And that one has a network security group associated with it as well. And then the other resources that get deployed in here are a key vault, an automation account, a storage account, and a log analytics workspace. And we reuse these four resources over and over again in other configurations as we go forward through the sandbox. So, just from a cost perspective, it makes sense to do that to keep the cost down for the sandbox. But in a production environment, you would typically see lots of key vaults and lots of automation accounts and lots of storage accounts. But for simplicity and again for cost, we're just going to use one of those and share them for a variety of different applications. So this VM, ADDS1 here, it's a Windows Server VM. It has two Windows Server features enabled on it, AD domain services, and also DNS, which is the AD integrated form of DNS. So this machine can function both as a Active Directory domain services domain controller, and it can also function as a DNS server. And you can see up here in our VNet, we definitely use it as the primary DNS server for our environment. Okay. Again, from a production standpoint, you typically have multiple DNS servers for high availability, but because this is just a sandbox environment and we want to keep the cost down, we just have one. And we're okay if it has, if it goes down, we can go fix it and bring it back up. No harm, no foul. It's not a production environment. Okay. And by default, when we configure that domain, the default domain name is mysandbox.local. Okay. And that means it's not a publicly registered domain name. You could, create something that is publicly registered. That's a little bit out of scope for this conversation, but maybe it's something we could do in a future video. Okay, so that's an overview of the architecture. So we kind of talked through these things, the resource group that gets deployed, the key vault, the log analytics workspace, the storage account, the automation account, the virtual network, that we're using, the Bastion host, and then the Windows Server virtual machine for running Active Directory domain services. Just want to talk about that a little bit. Azure Active Directory has a service called Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or AADDS. It gets very confusing, lots of acronyms. What that service is it's basically domain controllers as a service. We're not using that here because it's kind of a specialized offering. It's very powerful, and it has some limitations for large enterprises for backward compatibility with Active Directory domain services. So I elected not to use that service in the sandbox, but just to go with old school Active Directory domain controllers.